there was a personality test that that we took, a lot of me and my friends, and I realize now, as a more mature woman, that it only gives me those things only give you a general idea of the intricacy and wonderful way you were knit together in your mother's womb. But there were a bunch of questions, and you went through a very long test, and it uncovered your dominant characteristics of your personality. And one of the categories was whether or not you are a thinker or a feeler. And we would all agree that Jeremiah would have scored high on the feeling side of the questions, and others are more thinkers. Maybe Isaiah was a thinker, Paul was a thinker, but Jeremiah was definitely on the feelings end of it. In the book of Lamentations, a courageous prophet that we've looked at the last 2 weeks becomes a poet who masterfully communicates his feelings through lament. And at first glance, it may seem to be a gloomy exercise, but there is powerful hope in the middle of lament. So 5 chapters, they're poems. Each chapter is a poem. 4 of them follow an acrostic that follows the Hebrew alphabet, and the 5th chapter is more of a prayer. The poet uses language in vivid ways that are intended to evoke a response. How does it make you feel when you read Lamentations? When you read Jeremiah's lament, how does it make you feel when he describes the destruction of God's judgment on the people? Lamentations is not written to explain. It's written to evoke a response. And that's different than a lot of other books in our Bibles. So it does teach us something, but it teaches us something through a response to the words, recording the devastating destruction and danger of sin. Jeremiah's lament poems address 2 very common lies concerning suffering and pain. First of all, the lie that if I ignore my feelings in suffering and I ignore the pain, it will go away. If I just muscle through, it'll go away. Paste on a smile. Fake it till you make it. Because after all, Christians aren't supposed to be sad. Jeremiah models healthy lament as a pathway to trust God in our heartache. The second lie that suffering and pain can tempt us to is that when disappointing or hard things come into our life, it's because God is punishing us. That is a lie. That is not true. God's actions toward his people are never punitive. They are to draw us near his heart. They are to correct, but they draw us near, so why? So that we experience his deep care for us. Jesus took all the punitive wrath at the cross. And Romans 8 tells us there is therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So God is not punishing you when something hard comes into your life. Learning from Lamentations, we can feel deep anguish and sorrow over the hard seasons, over the disappointments that we experience, but at the same time, we can learn to trust the heart and purposes of God. So here's our big idea. Rather than lose hope, we can bring our sorrow to the God who never leaves or forsakes his people. Rather than lose hope, we can bring our sorrow to the God who never leaves or forsakes his people. So the outline has 3 divisions this week. First one, why we grieve, chapters 1 and 2. Why we can have hope, chapter 3, and why we can wait in faith, chapters 4 and 5. So open your Bible up to Lamentations, and we'll start off with why we grieve. If we were reading in the Hebrew, we would more clearly see the masterful use of language. So the form, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and in chapter 1, 2, and 4, there are 22 verses, and each verse starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So some of you who are memorizing Psalm 119, we know there's 22 stanzas of 8 verses that go along with the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. So it would be much more beautiful if we could read Hebrew. But anyway, I'm telling you that. Trust, and you have to trust that that's true. So chapter 3 has 66 verses. So in groups of 3, it follows the Hebrew alphabet. And chapter 5, though it is not an acrostic, it has 22 verses. It doesn't follow the acrostic pattern, but it is he ends with an attitude of prayer. That's pretty, I do well just to find words, much less put them together in this masterful way. But Jeremiah. His words and prayers of lament are weaved throughout the book in the context of a myriad of descriptions of Jerusalem's fall. You read them, they're graphic, they produce pictures in your mind. And you might ask yourself the question, is there any way to describe this that he hasn't recorded? But remember, his poems and his words were written to evoke a response. Lament is when we express deep sadness or grief with words that God hears and understands. When we experience in this life, what we experience in this life and our feelings in response to what we're experiencing, they never surprise God. He's intimately acquainted with all of our ways. He knows where our hearts hurt. So we don't have to hold back from expressing our feelings to him. We won't tell him something he doesn't already know, and he understands our pain better than we do. So when we find ourselves in distressing or overwhelming situations that are painful, it's tempting to give God the silent treatment. You're just confused, you're just discouraged, I can't even pray. And so you don't talk to him. And that's one of the things that lament teaches us not to do, is don't give God the silent treatment. Pour out your feelings. Healthy lament turns toward God, not away from him. And Jeremiah shows us that it's good to pour out your pain and disappointment, your questions, even your doubts, your impatience. If I bury my feelings, or if I attempt to deal with them in my own strength, I deny God the opportunity to care for me and show me his faithfulness. And that is not an authentic relationship with a personal God. Raw, honest words expressed builds intimacy. The 4 elements of lament: turn toward God, honestly bring your questions, and tell God all about your struggle and how you feel. And then boldly ask him to act, even if it looks impossible, and choose to trust. And we'll see that trust come out in the centerpiece in the middle of the book in chapter 3. So in chapter 1, Jeremiah is grieving Jerusalem's destruction, and he depicts the city as a grieving widow who's lost her reason for living. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is the one who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They become her enemies. These words paint a picture that communicates sadness and grief. People were gone, the city was destroyed, the splendor was ransacked. Those left were struggling to survive. The people were taken into captivity because of their sin. Now, other places in our Bibles where we find lament, it's not God's judgment that produces suffering. A third of the Psalms are lament, but if you think about Job, Job was a righteous man. He didn't do anything, and he suffered. God allowed that for a purpose, and he never understood why. Well, that's not the point. The point is to draw near to the heart of God in our suffering. Verse 16 of chapter 1. Lament. This is why I weep and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. In verses 18 and 19, Zion, the city personified, declares the Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. Listen, all you people, look on my suffering. My young men and young women have gone into exile. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food to keep themselves alive. The city personified considers the judgments that they are experiencing justifiable discipline because of their rebellion. And then the city turns their attention to the Lord. Verse 20. See, Lord, how distressed I am. I'm in torment within, and in my heart I am disturbed. For I've been most rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves, inside there is only death. The distress of suffering is I am disturbed in my heart. I think we've probably all been there. So in chapter 1, Jeremiah describes the ugly reality of a ravaged city in 1 through 11. And then in 12 to 22, he describes the city personified and describing its sorrow. Chapter 2 is now from the Lord's perspective, the Lord's anger. 1 through 10 is the Lord's perspective, and 11 through 22 is the human perspective. So look at chapter 2, 1 through 3, the Lord's perspective. How the Lord has covered daughter Zion with the cloud of his anger. He's hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He's not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Without pity, the Lord swallowed up all the dwellings of Jacob. In his wrath, he's torn down the strongholds of daughter Judah. He's brought her kingdom and its princes down in dishonor. In fierce anger, he's cut off every horn of Israel. He's withdrawn his right hand at the approach of the enemy. He's burned in Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything around it. Wow. The human perspective, look at verse 11. My eyes fail from weeping. I'm in torment within. My heart is pounded out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. They say to their mothers, "Where's bread and wine?" as they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms. The consequences have come for the people, and rather than being a light to the nations that God had intended them to be, they have become a warning beacon for the damage that sin brings. And then in verse 19 of chapter 2, Jeremiah calls the people to pour out their questions in lament. Arise, cry out in the night as the watches of the night begin. Pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the lives of your children, and faint from hunger at every street corner. 20 through 22, he pours out even more questions. Look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they've cared for? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and young women have fallen by the sword. You've slain them in the day of your anger. You've slaughtered them without pity. So he comes to the Lord and he says, how can you treat us this way? How can this be right? How can this be consistent with who you are? The destruction that sin brings causes great sadness and lament. And Dr. Talley made this point in this section of Lamentations, and he said, Jerusalem did not fall in one day. It took years of compromise and complacency, of turning their gaze away from the Lord for the city to reach the point of total destruction. They had become like the people around them, step by step. And then he said this, the wickedness of any people will eventually result in the disintegration of a society. And if we look around us, we are in danger of that very thing. And God's people need to be on guard. So the question in response is we have to ask ourselves, these descriptions, this is what sin brings. Do we can take our sin lightly? Do we take the sin in our society lightly? God had been to the people very, very, very patient with them, with all the ups and downs of their obedience and their unfaithfulness. Since the covenant at Mount Sinai, he had been with them in the ups and downs. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I think I'll destroy my life today with sin. But what it happens, small increments of sin left unconfessed or left to grow. And that's what happened. One by one, decisions of compromise take you in a direction of worldliness. It takes you in a direction that you never intended to go. Jerusalem was destroyed, and it brought much sorrow and heartache. First principle, sin's destruction causes God's people great pain and sorrow. Sin's destruction causes God's people great pain and sorrow. That truth is true for every person in every culture, in every generation. Sin is destructive. So if we learn nothing else, let's learn that sin is serious. And it's not to be trifled with. It's not to be taken lightly. It brings trouble. So let's be honest with God and bring our lament to God when we see sin's destruction in our life, in the life of our families, in the life of our friends, in the life of our country. Let's pour out our honest lament and cultivate a deep and abiding faith with God that is unstained by the world. Division 2, Chapter 3, Why We Can Have Hope. Somebody described Jeremiah's language, his use of language, as raw footage. You know, he doesn't soft sell anything. He doesn't cut out a really nasty part and skip it and give us just the easier parts to digest. There's no editing. But in all this language, the hope that we find in the middle of this lament in chapter 3 is 3 times as long as the other chapters, describing the fall of Jerusalem. Theme of chapter 3 is Jeremiah's personal experience through the trauma. And it's a mix of grief and hope. He is real. He is authentic. He is not afraid to express questions. Chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. Keep in mind, he's a faithful follower of God, a servant of God, and he is in the middle of this trauma. He's driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. Jeremiah, let's go down now to verse 13. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mocked me in song all day long. We read similar descriptions of his ministry when we were in the book of Jeremiah. He's filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He's trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. Raw footage of the pain and sadness. And Jeremiah may have been saying, if we put it in our own words, this is enough. I can't take anymore. I'm at the lowest. I'm at the lowest. And then something happens, right? In verse 21, something happens. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope in my lowest moment. I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, to the one who seeks him. It's good to wait quietly for the salvation. It's good for a man to bear the yoke while he's young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. No one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. So what happened? What changed? Boy, it was an abrupt change, wasn't it? It was from the low to now hope, truth. Jeremiah's circumstances and his feelings have been brought under truth about God and God's character. Healthy lament considers what is true even in your pain, even when you can't see it, when you can't understand. God is near to the brokenhearted, and God may have brought this truth to his mind when he said, I can't take it anymore. You know what? When you're not in trauma, when you're not in deep pain and sorrow, that's the time to learn the truth about God, to memorize the truth about God when we're not experiencing trouble, so that when you're in pain and anguish, truth can be called to mind. He's reminded about what is true, even in the midst of trauma. and he calls for repentance in verse 40. And he says, as a prophet, he doesn't just talk to the people, he identifies with the people. Let us examine our ways and test them. Let us return to the Lord. As Jeremiah pondered the affliction the Lord had brought upon his people, he knew at the same time that God was with him. He had walked with him faithfully for many years through many hard circumstances, and this is no different, maybe a little bit more intense, but God was with him. And even as he confessed God's unfailing presence and his purpose, look at verse 49. My eyes will flow unceasingly without relief. Okay, 48. Streams of tears flow from my eyes because my people are destroyed. So he's confessed truth about God. He's called himself and the people to confess, but the pain remains. The tears are still flowing. His enemies are still attacking him, 52 to 54. And then in verse 55, he says, I called on your name, Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. 57, you came near when I called you, and you said, do not fear. How does this work? How do we reconcile great, troubling trauma that hurts deeply and the truth about God? How do you cling to God through tears that don't stop? How do you acknowledge pain and God's faithfulness at the same time? Sometimes God calls us to trust him while we wait for resolution and relief. In times of deepest pain, God's presence and power might be all we have. And we cling to it when relief is not our reality, it's still a prayer. Can you mourn and pray at the same time? Can God be trusted with what hasn't been resolved yet? He can. His compassions never fail. He is great in faithfulness. He is my portion. He is enough. Great is his unfailing love. So if we don't go through troubling times, we may not fully in the deep places of our heart and mind believe that or know that. But when you suffer, you experience it personally and you find him to be who he says he is. Because of who God is, there is hope. Not because of what we can see, not because everything's been resolved and tied up with a nice bow, because what I know is true about his character, I can place my hope in him. So second principle, God's steadfast love and faithfulness gives God's people enduring hope. God's steadfast love and faithfulness gives God's people enduring hope. So what truth do you need to insert into your lament, into your troubling situation? Will you memorize a truth about God or a promise that you can call to mind when your emotions are trying to dominate? Bringing your emotions under truth. Truth that will replace worry, fear, or anxiety. Okay, Division 3 is chapters 4 and 5. So chapter 4 is more descriptions of the people suffering, but this time he uses the tool of contrast, and he shows the current losses suffered by the people, and he compares that with their former splendor. Chapter 4, verse 1, how the gold has lost its luster, the fine gold has become dull. The sacred gems are scattered at every street corner. Children beg for bread, no one gives it to them. Starvation is widespread, extreme. Suffering is touching every segment of society. But look at verse 22. Verse 22 says, your punishment will end, daughter Zion. He will not prolong your exile, but he will punish your enemy, Edom, and expose her wickedness. In verse 22, we can see that the people can look forward to restoration. They can look forward to an end of their trouble. I don't know how your pages are, but if you glance at chapter 5, verse 19, it says, you, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. God is sovereignly controlling the timing of events and is the righteous judge. We can wait, surrendering to his sovereign rule, even when things are hard, when times are hard. And our times may be getting harder. And we're going to need to remember these things. Chapter 5 breaks the acrostic pattern and is praying for God's mercy. Jeremiah prays for the people because of their suffering. And as God's prophet, he identifies with them as he prays. Verse 1, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Prayed for the fatherless, the widows, the famine, their subservience as slaves to a foreign people, the violation of the women, slaughter of their rulers, the mistreatment of the elderly, child labor. There is no music or joy. Verse 15, joy is gone from our hearts, our dancing has turned to mourning. But you, Lord, reign forever. If God is on his throne ruling eternally, then he's ruling today. And he was ruling in this situation, and he will rule sovereignly in our lives when trouble comes. In Lament, Jeremiah brings the situation together with truth about God. The truth is God's in control, and everything that touches our lives comes through his hands. And I will admit to you, that is super hard to wrap our minds around. It is hard when your heart is breaking to accept that. It's hard, but it's true. And God is near, and we can trust his character. And we can trust if something's happening in our lives, it's happening by his design. And he's good. And it will produce good in his mind and from his perspective. We can trust his purposes are always good from his perspective, even when we don't understand. Jeremiah prays for restoration and renewal, to restore what was lost. Restore us to yourself so we can live as your people once more. Verse 21. And then the last verse, we got to just admit it. It's kind of weird. It's not where we would end, right? Restore to us, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you've utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. The end. What do we? Is it too late? Is it too late for you to restore us? Maybe. I think even Hebrew scholars are debate on what this is supposed to be about. But it could be an expression of trust, recognizing God's the one who rules and reigns, and he would decide. This sad prophet knows the truth about God, that he's faithful and is the eternal power over his creation. So he says, unless you see it differently, let God be God and come under his authority and his sovereignty. Despite severe suffering because of her sin, Judah had not been abandoned as a nation. God's covenant with Israel was still operative despite her disobedience. His loving kindness would never cease, and his compassions never fail. God would send his Son, the perfect King, to build and restore and rule over his perfect kingdom. Jeremiah shows us what to do when we're caught in the not yet of God's promises. We wait and we trust. Surrender to him and entrust our good days and our heartaches to his righteous character and purposes. Last principle. Prayer makes it possible to trust him as his people wait for promises to be fulfilled. And being together in a community of others who are waiting for promises to be fulfilled is encouraging. That's a good thing. So prayer makes it possible to trust him as his people wait for promises to be fulfilled. What do we learn from this book? Life will bring us pain, and sometimes it's deep pain. We can learn from Jeremiah, rather than losing hope, we can have faith to persevere. We can turn toward God and not away from him. We can pour out our feelings, and we can pray. You can cry and pray at the same time. You can hurt and heal at the same time. You can struggle and have faith at the same time. Trust that God is near and his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. Father, this is a hard book, and yet this is life-transforming truth, because all of us know that life is hard. And we can run to you, pour out our feelings, our questions, and find you faithful. So thank you. And Father, would you continue the discussion in groups in a way that will make us stronger in our faith and